shows few similar food-based social enterprises have operated on a purely profit-driven model. Wage costs are high, and the Wellington market is too small. So there was that angle as well, Anton. I think we discussed this before, that every area has its own particular challenges, but the Wellington one is that there's a lot of churn going on within the food sector there.
Yeah. Oh, look, in Christchurch is the same. Every week, I mean, we're about to open a complex in Christchurch, and we don't need any more restaurants, but we're about to open a complex with about another 10 or 12. So, yeah, look, it's funny. Everyone thinks that they want to own a restaurant until they own one, and then they go, well, I should have thought this one through. But look, it's hard work, and it's pretty cutthroat, unfortunately.
Okay. On a very related note, I wanted to sort of bring in this. I've been meaning to do this for a while because I wanted to talk about this wonderful video that I saw, again on Stuff, and in particular it was a video about people who go to a certain ramen shop, and this is in Boston, where people queue up for an hour to get in, and it got me thinking about what I call destination dishes. That is a dish that is so good that you would travel out of your way for. Now, for me, it has to be, I've got to tell you about this particular dish that I can't get out of my head. It's in Dunedin. I won't give away the name of the place, but it's a spicy sausage and seafood soup that no one else in the country can make. And whenever I go to Dunedin, I will seek this spicy sausage and seafood out. And here's the thing about a destination dish. You can't get it anywhere else, just that place. And that is what the small ramen workshop in Boston has got going for it. People turn up for their favourite bowl of noodles. So around the panel, is there a particular, what I'd call, destination dish that you have in your mind right now? Anton Matthews, what about you?
Well, of course, I'm a bit biased, but fish and chips probably. No, but in all seriousness, if I'm not in Christchurch eating fish, Ferg burger comes to mind. I love a good Ferg burger when I go down to Queenstown. On the rare occasions I go down to Queenstown. I can't go past fish and chips and a Ferg burger.
Good on you. A Ferg burger. I've heard about this place in Queenstown, and it too has quite a few people lining up every now and then, doesn't it? What is it about those burgers?
I think it's the legend. It's the story of Ferg Burger. You know, I mean, you can't help but you just drive down the street, and I tell you, 21 hours of the day I think they're open, and there is a line every single hour of that day. I kid you not. So if you haven't eaten it, you know, you haven't lived.
My producer says, "OMG, you've never had a Ferg burger." There you go.
Yep, my face is saying the same thing. I have to take you sometime.
Oh, look, hey, it's a date. When the next time in that area. All right, what about you, Cindy?
Well, I do have to say that I looked into this ramen story, and they're not actually just queuing for the food. It is an experience, not a religious experience, but it's
a get-together.
Well, no, you have to talk about your dream at the end of it. So it's you get the food. If you eat all the food, then you get a big clap, and what that means is you are able to pursue your dream. I mean, it's like a self-help. Self-help workshop in a restaurant. But for me, and this is going to sound a little bit dicky, I would travel for miles for the Amano ravioli with crayfish in it. I know.
Oh, what a way to end a Friday.
I'm sorry. And it's in a butter sauce, and I lie in Karaka in my bed and I dream about it. And I would drive 2 hours to get to it.
You're drooling, Cindy. You're drooling.
I know. It is so good.
Oh,
and I wait. Settle down. Get down. Settle down.
Behave yourself.
Anton Matthews, Cindy Michener, thank you very much. Emil, thank you.
Kia ora.
Te whakarongo mai koe ki te reo irirangi o Aotearoa. This is Checkpoint on RNZ National. I'm Lisa Owen. E Hariaki nei, an emergency motel stay meant to last just 7 days has blown out to 600 nights for one person waiting for a house. Why has a temporary solution turned into a six-figure norm? Quake insurer Southern Response rates itself 8 out of 10 for performance despite expensive ongoing litigation and a court ruling that found it deceived and misled claimants. So why are staff still getting bonuses? Almost 6 months on, a man seriously injured in the mosque attacks is afraid to leave his home because of ongoing racial abuse.
RNZ News at 5. Kia ora, ko Susana Leata tēnei. Helen Clark says now is the time for New Zealand to join the international shift on cannabis regulation. The former Prime Minister spoke today at a symposium on drug law reform at Parliament, a year out from the cannabis referendum. She says she has long advocated legalising and regulating cannabis.
You can go back 25 years and find a speech on the public record for me saying that I did not think cannabis should be dealt with through the criminal system. And I think now its time has come with the international movement towards a different way of treating it.
Helen Clark says Canada, Uruguay and 11 US states have all moved to legalise cannabis. The government is bringing in harsher penalties for those who illegally trade firearms in a bid to stop guns getting into the hands of criminals. The Police Minister Stuart Nash says new legislation will create a registry of guns and new offences and penalties for illegal manufacture, trafficking or changing markings on firearms. Doctors would be able to notify the police if they feel a licence holder shouldn't use a firearm for physical or mental health reasons, and an advisory group of gun owners and non-owners would be set up. At the announcement in Christchurch this afternoon, the Prime Minister said she hopes the bill gets the support of all of Parliament.
I think the changes that are being made here are fair and reasonable. They're about ensuring people who need to access guns can, but those who shouldn't don't. And that also we try and prevent guns moving into the black market and from being used illegally.
The Prime Minister, Jacinda Ardern. In the United States, the third Democratic Party debate featuring 10 presidential hopefuls has brought out broad unity on toughening gun law. One candidate, Beto O'Rourke, doubled down on his plan to ban assault weapons after 22 people were killed in a mass shooting in his hometown of El Paso last month.
I met the mother of a 15-year-old girl who was shot by an AR-15, and that mother watched her bleed to death over the course of an hour because so many other people were shot by that AR-15. Hell yes, we're going to take your AR-15, your AK-47.
Beto O'Rourke advocates a compulsory buyback of assault weapons similar to the one underway in this country. An advocacy group for migrant workers has been protesting outside the Prime Minister's electorate office in Auckland, calling for government action. Migrant students who have been stuck in limbo since their school was deregistered or whose families are separated because of visa issues held placards outside Jacinda Ardern's Mount Albert office. The protest was organised by the Migrant Workers Association. Sher Singh from the association says many people are waiting months for visa applications to be approved, and that's not good enough.
I'm calling on the government to take some responsibility. I'm calling on the government to take some action. I'm calling on the government to take this action with very seriousness.
Immigration New Zealand says it is doing everything possible to minimise any delay, but processing time will always depend on the complexity of an application. A business owner caught up in the collapse of the building company Stanley Group says he might take legal action if it turns out the group broke the law. The first liquidators report has found the group owed $9.5 million to creditors when the companies were placed in liquidation last week. It also says the companies may not have held enough money in retention as required by law. One creditor, Dave Burt, who's owed $60,000, says if it's true, the director should be held to account, even if it means doing it himself.
If there's any misappropriations as far as the retention fund is concerned, and if there's any evidence of reckless trading, I really want to see those directors held to account. If $9 million of other people's money has gone, someone needs to be held to account.
Dave Burt, the director of Team Cabling. The Wellington City Council has approved a $1 million fund to help owners of quake-prone buildings. Funding will be split between an existing fund for heritage buildings and the newly established Building Resilience Fund for non-heritage ones. The chair of the council's grants committee, Sarah Free, says the fund will allow eligible owners to do detailed seismic assessments ahead of strengthening. It'll help to help manage the limited funds available. She says the council is targeting the money to those who might otherwise struggle to get such work done. A man who sold planes belonging to Sir Peter Jackson and pocketed the money has been convicted of fraud. A High Court jury in Wellington has today found Eugene John DeMarco guilty of 6 counts of fraud. The 57-year-old committed the crimes while production manager at a company called the Vintage Aviator. The director of the Serious Fraud Office, Julie Reid, says his offending was premeditated and driven by self-interest.
This case was really about a betrayal of trust. The defendant, Jean DeMarco, betrayed the trust of his employers, Peter Jackson and Fran Walsh. He betrayed the trust of his friend, Oliver Wolf. He betrayed the Warbirds charity and finally his bank.
Julie Reid says the SFO will take action in such cases to protect New Zealand's reputation as a safe place to invest and do business. It's 5:05. The All Blacks loose forward Luke Jacobson has been ruled out of the Rugby World Cup before the tournament has even kicked off. Jacobson showed concussion symptoms after his Test debut against Argentina last month, but was past fit to play against Tonga last weekend. He appeared to come through the game with no ill effects, but problems emerged after the All Blacks' first training run in Japan. Jacobson says it was difficult breaking the news to his teammates.
It was pretty tough going around and you sort of shook all the boys' hands and whatnot and realising that going to be going, but all the boys have been really supportive, just getting on my side sort of thing. And
the Tasman flanker Shannon Frizzell has been called in as Jacobson's replacement. Meanwhile, the former All Blacks winger Joe Rokothoko has retired from rugby. Joint second on the All Blacks all-time try scorers list, he has been with French club Racing 92 for the past 5 seasons. A third US Open finalist has signed up for next year's ASB Tennis Classic in Auckland. Organisers have announced Russia's Daniil Medvedev is set to play in the men's tournament. Women's finalists Bianca Andreescu and Serena Williams have already been confirmed. And the Australian veteran Lee Holdsworth has topped the practice timesheets ahead of Kiwi driver Shane van Gisbergen on day one of the Supercars Auckland Super Sprint at Pukekohe. Runaway championship leader New Zealand's Scott McLaughlin was 7th fastest. That's the news.
Tonight on Night's Country Life heads to North Canterbury to see how farmers there are coping 3 years after the big shake. Henwehe Mohi, the woman who brought Aotearoa to the forefront of God Defend New Zealand, selects the mixtape. Julia Deans is the Friday Night Live act, and Mike Price introduces us to the element potassium. So obviously, we're going bananas for this week's Sonic Tonic on Nights with me, Brian Crump, after the news at 7 on RNZ National.
Now the short forecast from Met Service to midnight tomorrow. Northland to Taranaki, including Coromandel, Bay of Plenty and Central High Country. Fine spells and a few showers. Rain tomorrow afternoon or evening, possibly heavy. For Gisborne and Hawke's Bay, fine spells, a few spots of rain tomorrow night. Manawatu, Whanganui and the Tararua district, fine tonight. Isolated showers, scattered rain tomorrow evening. For the remainder of Wairarapa, Kapiti and Wellington, also Bulla, Nelson and Marlborough. Periods of rain this evening, possibly heavy. Norwesterly gales will ease. Westland rain easing to isolated showers. Canterbury, rain easing to isolated showers, rain returning in the north tomorrow afternoon. Otago, Southland and Fiordland, occasional showers, some heavy at first in the south, mainly fine tomorrow. And Chatham Islands, fine, then a few showers from tonight, rain later tomorrow. RNZ National, it's coming up to 5:08.
Thank you, Susanna. Happy Friday, everyone, and this is Checkpoint. I'm Lisa Owen. More than $126,000 of taxpayers' money has been spent on one person's motel stay while they waited for public housing to become available. The stay covered more than 600 nights, despite the fact emergency housing grants are only supposed to cover 7-night stays. But as pressure for public housing grows, more and more people are spending weeks and regularly months in motels. Nita Blake-Person reports.
The government now spends more than $3 billion per year on housing assistance, with more and more of that money being spent on motels. Emergency housing grants, which cover short-term accommodation, were introduced in July 2016 as a stopgap measure, but are increasingly being used for longer stays as the housing crisis bites. There are 1,899 households in private motels, with 381 of those in motels for more than 3 months at a cost of $1,500 each a week. Figures show it's big business for some motels, with 5 providers alone receiving $20 million in the last 3 years to provide shelter for the homeless. The top earner is an Auckland motelier that's been paid $6.1 million. The Salvation Army's Lynette Hudson says while motel accommodation is a good short-term stopgap, it has become much more than that.
The government have stepped up and are responding, but it's just shifted the problem from people having been homeless and living in cars and couch surfing, a whole range of just homeless options, to being in motel units, which is really no solution at all for a permanent solution, because people still don't have a home. It's at least a roof over their heads and keeping people off the street, but we're still faced with this terrible shortage of housing.
Motel stays are typically granted for 7 nights at a time, but in one case, a person was put up for 615 nights. The cost? $126,000. Kathleen Paraha works with the Auckland Action Against Poverty and says many people are in the same boat, struggling to find permanent, affordable accommodation. The public housing waitlist is growing fast, reaching a record 11,655 in July. Kathleen Paraha says she's been helping one elderly man who's been on the housing waitlist for months.
He doesn't get enough to to go into a private home. He doesn't get enough to rent. He's been waiting since March last year. He's been A19 since March last year. The highest you can go is A20. He's going from motel to motel.
A Treasury briefing to the incoming Housing Minister, Megan Wood, says increasing accommodation costs disadvantage the young and those with lower incomes who are less likely to own a home. 18-year-old Aucklander Kayla Edwards is among those struggling with housing. She's pregnant and has a 1-year-old son. The family has been forced to go and get government help to stay in several motels over the past few months because they had nowhere else to go.
I hated it. It was just so stressful. It got to the point where I kept ending up in hospital multiple times. It was like 3-4 times a month I was going in and out of hospital, and I got told it was because I was stressing out and stuff. And my anxiety attacks and everything has just gotten really bad to me, and now I got referred to the maternal mental health, and now and sometimes I get told that I have to be put on pills.
In a statement, the Minister responsible for public housing, Chris Farfoy, says the government has allocated just under $500 million in this year's budget to address homelessness and is considering more options for suitable accommodation for those in the most need, as it recognises there is more to be done. Mō te hōtaka o te ahi pōnei, ko Nita Blake Person aho.
It's 12 minutes past 5 and you're with Checkpoint on RNZ National. Do get in touch about whatever is on your mind this evening. I'm wondering what you make of the amount of money we are spending on emergency accommodation here. One motelier there getting $6.1 million. What's the solution, and is it coming fast enough? You can text us on 2101, you can tweet us at Checkpoint RNZ or email checkpoint@rnz.co.nz. 8 out of 10 for performance and deserving of bonuses. That's Southern Response's report card, according to its board chair. And that's despite the state quake insurer being tied up in ongoing and expensive legal action. Southern Response is appealing a High Court decision that found it misled and deceived claimants Carl and Alison Dodds when it kept secret from them a higher detailed repair assessment to rebuild their quake-damaged home. Now, that meant the couple unwittingly settled for hundreds of thousands of dollars less, and the court ordered the insurer to pay up. Southern Response says the appeal is about getting clarity around questions raised by the judgment, but a court document shows it's asking for the decision to be overturned and wants the Dodds to pay its court costs. I asked Southern Response Chair Alistair James if he thinks the decision to appeal is fair.
I was present yesterday with the ministers and Anthony Honeybone when we met with them and their lawyers, Peter Woods and Tim Grimwood. So I understand it's a very stressful situation. Not only the court proceedings, which are always demanding on people, but of course, having gone through the Christchurch earthquakes and lost their beautiful home.
Is it the fair thing to do, though? Because does that matter?
Well, I think the decision has implications beyond Carl and Alison Dodds, and I guess to try and alleviate the distress for them is that we have indicated that we would willingly pay their past legal costs in terms of the proceedings and in terms of the costs of the legal fees for the Court of Appeal proceedings as well. The notice of appeal has now been filed, but their decision certainly has implications for how we deal with other like cases, and we need to get better clarification than what we have.
And you're seeking costs on appeal.
Well, that would be a standard appeal that is filed, but I guess that is a matter for consideration during the course of the proceedings or following the outcome of the proceedings.
But you're seeking costs in relation to the High Court and the appeal. Why would you do that?
Look, I said that's what's been the relief that's been sought in the notice of appeal. I think that's just a standard form of appeal, but as I said, we have indicated that we are willing to pay the legal costs of Mr and Mrs Dodds in terms of the proceedings so far in the Court of Appeal proceedings.
How much do you estimate that to be, the cost to the Dodds so far, that bill?
Well, that would be significant. I don't know the actual amount because my expectation is that this is a matter that will be agreed between the solicitors for Southern Response and the solicitors for Mr and Mrs Dodds. So I don't know this stage, of course, what the future costs are. I guess that's for...
No, to date. What about the costs to date? You must have a general idea.
Sorry?
You must have a general idea.
Well, I don't have a general idea because I haven't seen those figures. So I don't know what the lawyers for Mr and Mrs Dodds have sought or are seeking. But,
so what have the costs been to Southern Response so far to take this legal action in the Dodds case?
Well, I don't know the actual amount of those costs either, but I said that it will be significant.
Southern Response, under their values, they say that they will treat their stakeholders with care, consideration and fairness, that you will demonstrate honesty, transparency and fairness, and we will hold ourselves accountable for our actions. We aim for excellence in everything we do. How well has Southern Response done in living up to those values?
Well, I think that, look, I said that there have been mistakes made. This has been a very difficult environment since 2011. But I believe that far the majority of Southern Response customers who have settled their claims will have been satisfied.
You had people on hunger strikes.
Yes, and look, and unfortunately, that is they are events that have occurred way before my time, and so I'm not so familiar with the circumstances. Although I lived in Christchurch at the time, and I was aware of those things happening.
Yeah. So what have you done though to put it right and to change the culture within Southern Response?
Well, look, I don't support cases having to go to litigation, and so.
Then why are they going to litigation?
We have encouraged staff to settle claims fairly and in accordance with policies. Of course, we now have the advantage of the Christchurch claims resettlement service.
And I understand that, but you've just said, and I'm sorry to interrupt you, but this is important. You have just said that you don't support cases going to litigation. So did you support the Doddses being taken back to court or not?
Yes, I do. Yes, I do. And so Southern
So are you
Response
uncomfortable with it
the
then?
appeal, but the appeal itself was a decision made by the Crown. And we had input into that decision, of course. And so you had Crown law taking a separate lens from ourselves as to whether this was a decision that should be appealed. And that was the recommendation, no doubt, to the Attorney-General.
Are you uncomfortable in any way about this going back to court, the Dodds' case?
Not this case, no. But I'm uncomfortable in a general sense of any cases having to end up in the higher courts.
Do you feel that there are customers of Southern Response who have been wronged?
Look, I guess, as I said, mistakes will have happened, and there are no doubt some cases where people perhaps haven't had their fair entitlement, and of course there are still cases where people are in dispute with Southern Response, where we're seeking to settle those claims, often through GCCRS or through other forms of mediation.
So are those people that were tricked into taking lower office because they were operating a 2-quote or a 2-DRA system?
Well, again, we don't have any figures that we can accurately say it's this number or that number. But in terms of a 2-quote system, it wasn't a 2-quote system. It was a detailed repair and rebuild analysis that I think could probably best be referred to as a scope of works, where certain figures were not disclosed to some customers.
Regardless of what we call it, the outcome was the same. They were given lower figures and feel that they were tricked into settling for lower sums of money.
Where they were not taking a rebuild option, but were taking the option to purchase another property somewhere else.
Now, despite the fact that you say that you would prefer that cases don't end in litigation, you don't support that. I think about $10 million has been spent on your watch on litigation. So yes. Are too many cases still ending up in court?
Well, I think so, but look, these are cases where we are the defendant or respondent, not the applicant, and so where people prefer to go down the option of filing proceedings in the High Court, we have no other option. But
they're going to High Court because they don't think they're getting a fair deal, aren't they? So we're in a circle here, aren't we?
But there are other forms of resolving disputes, and it's those other forms of resolving disputes that we are encouraging.
And in the case of the Dodds, you are the ones who are taking it back to court.
Indeed.
In terms of expense, what information do you have about your liability relating to the Dodds case and other similar cases?
Well, I'm not going to discuss that because it's open
Why
speculation.
Not?
Well, I think it is inappropriate with the Court of Appeal proceedings.
Well, taxpayers might believe it's appropriate because it's their money that's being spent and potentially the bill that they will have to foot. So, again, what have you been told about what your financial liability could look like?
Well, look, there have been different figures bandied about, and I think it's
so talk us through them. What figures have you got? What figures have you got?
Well, the figures are really very speculative and back pocket figures.
What are they?
And I'm not going to disclose those because I think more detailed work
is that because those figures are scary?
Possibly on a case-by-case. Well, not as scary as I think the billions that you referred to on your program yesterday with Minister Robertson.
So do you think it will be less than $1 billion?
Oh, significantly so.
Okay, how much less than $1 billion? Hundreds of millions?
Well, it could be on the outside. That would be an outside figure.
So how many hundreds of millions? Give me a range.
No, I'm not prepared to give you a range. But one of the difficulties
you're talking a big chunk of money here, and it is taxpayer money. So
well, let's agree it's a big chunk of money. But look, one of the dangers of speculating about these amounts is that when Southern Response was established by the government to take over from the failed AMI insurance at that stage, there were figures mentioned of $600-700 million as being the end cost to the Crown. We are now up to almost 1.5 million as it is, billion. So this has been...
Sorry, can you say that again?
1.5 billion has been the cost, is almost the cost so far to the taxpayer. So this is the largest taxpayer bailout, I suspect, ever in New Zealand.
On a scale of 1 to 10, 10 being absolutely stellar, outstanding performance, and 1 being abysmal, how would you rate the performance of Southern Response in looking after its clients and customers?
Look, I would rate it 8.
Seriously?
Yes, seriously. I have confidence in the Chief Executive and the staff, and I want to say that, staff come to Southern Response every day wanting to settle claims. There's no staff bonuses for settling for less, and there's certainly no policy that people should settle for less than what a customer is entitled to.
What are their staff bonuses for?
Well, there's no staff bonuses for settling for less or achieving some financial target. There's none of those sort of bonuses.
Right. So what are their bonuses for then?
Well, their bonuses would be for their overall performance, including the number of claims that are settled in a timely fashion.
How many bonuses have you paid in recent years? And what's the value of those bonuses?
Well, I'm not in a position to tell you that, and that's a matter between the employer and the employee.
So I'm not asking you to identify people. Just give me an overall figure. So in the last 12 months, in the last financial year, how much did you pay in bonuses to Southern Response staff members?
Well, it's not significant, and I don't have those figures at hand.
So what's not significant?
Well, I'm not in a position to disclose any figures to you because I don't have those figures with me.
Okay, so tell me a bit about the key performance indicators then that you're measuring them against in order to determine whether they deserve bonuses. Talk me through it.
Well, I guess that the things that would be reflected in an employee's performance is really the number of claims that they have been involved in, that they've been able to achieve fair and timely settlements. That's probably the most significant performance indicator.
And so how do you determine what's fair in terms of those performance indicators?
Well, where houses have been successfully repaired, where properties that have been, or where customers have elected to have a rebuild, where there's been a successful rebuild that's been completed, and otherwise in terms of those customers who have sought cash settlements and where they've been achieved on a fair and reasonable basis.
And what about customer feedback? Is that taken into account, whether the customer thinks they've been fairly treated, well treated? Are you taking that into account before you pay a bonus?
Well, yes, look...
and how do you register that then?
We do get feedback in terms of customer feedback, and I have to say that in the early days of Southern Response, the level of feedback was actually very positive. I accept that we've got to a stage now where the remaining claims are particularly complex and difficult, and I guess that the level of customer satisfaction will be less.
Can we please get a figure from you for the number of bonuses you've paid in the last financial year?
Sure. We'll look into that.
That was the chair of Southern Response, Alistair James. Now, Southern Response has just provided us with those figures that we asked for. It says the total amount paid in staff bonuses for the past financial year is $1.13 million, and that 130 staff were eligible for bonuses. Southern Response also says the value of those bonuses represents about 6.5% of the total claims handling expense for the year. It says performance payments are based on targets that include both quantitative targets and soft skills, such as effective communication, outstanding customer service, and undertaking tasks beyond job expectations. But that does not relate in any way to the amount that a customer is paid. One of the men badly injured in the March 15 mosque attacks is afraid to leave his Christchurch home after being racially abused and threatened with violence. Mohammed Sahadat has been unable to work as a chef since he was shot at the Linwood Mosque nearly 6 months ago. Already struggling to cope with the mental trauma brought on by that day, his recovery has been made harder by 2 further attacks on him and his wife that happened in broad daylight. Conan Young reports.
The bullet entered Mohammed Sahadat's hand and travelled all the way up his arm, exiting at his shoulder. Using his former employer, Ahmed Jahangir, as an interpreter, he tells me if he had been facing right instead of left, the bullet would have hit him in the head.
उस टाइम मुझे कुछ पता नहीं चला गोली कहाँ से आई.
God has saved him, he says, otherwise if he would have, if he would have faced towards right and then he would have died, and it was God who has saved him.
Mohammed Sahadat has lost all use of his right arm and has been told by his doctors that he may never be able to work as a chef again. The mental scars from that day are also taking a long time to heal.
Everything is very fresh, what happened that day. And when he goes now for the prayer, he's never comfortable. He can't pray with the peace of mind. While he's in prayer, whenever car passes by, he gets that fear in his heart, thinking that someone is again coming to, attack us.
And what's making it even harder for Sahadat to put the horrific attack behind him? Recently, he's twice been threatened with violence and racially abused by members of the public in suburban Christchurch. The first time he was with his wife on his way back from the supermarket when a teenager and an older man blocked their way, asked if they were from the mosque and threatened to kill them. It happened again a short time later, this time involving another teenager.
तो वो बोल रहा है, hey man, I beat you man.
So he just scared now to step out of the house. Even now, after 4 months, he's basically not, free of anything. These kind of incidents make everything fresh again for him. He doesn't feel safe. He doesn't feel safe to step out of house. Mosque is just, say, about a couple of hundred meters from here. And he loves to go to mosque, but he's scared about all these things. And, while coming back, it's not about the night, he says. During the day, the first incident of two men he was talking about, it happened on midday around 12:50. And so during the daylight, he's being tortured.
This is the first time Ahmed has heard about these attacks on Sahadat and his family.
It's a very bad thing. Few people, I don't understand, how can they just even think of doing like this? They should just show mercy on them. People like him, especially like us, if we have gone through already so many things, and again, I don't understand. It's hard to accept the reality, but this is the reality.
Sahadat, his wife and their 4 children are living with other mosque survivors in temporary accommodation organised by the Ministry of Social Development. The government minister in charge of coordinating support for victims, Megan Woods, says this is the first she's heard of people there being subjected to racist abuse and threats of violence.
Racism didn't disappear on the 15th of March, and it is all of our responsibility to ensure that we're not tolerating that in our society, that kind of hatred has no place in Christchurch or New Zealand, and that we don't want it here. And I certainly want to know if anyone is feeling unsafe, then we need to make sure that there is adequate security for them. These families have been through enough. Being subjected to racist taunts or threats is simply not acceptable.
Sahadat hopes he can soon find permanent housing in another part of town, away from the people who have been targeting them, so he can give his family the better life they moved to New Zealand for. Kei o tō tahi ahau, mō te hotaka o te ahi, ko konanyang tēnei.
And you can hear more about Sahadat's story on Insight in a special piece marking 6 months since the mosque attacks. You can podcast now or listen just after the 8 o'clock news on Sunday morning with Jim Mora. He also features in an extended web feature marking the anniversary, which you can view now on rnz.co.nz. And we'll put Conan's piece, speaking to Sahadat, on our webpage as well. And in Christchurch today, the Prime Minister announced that an extra $8.7 million has been set aside over the next 3 years for mental health support for people affected by the attacks. She also introduced a new bill to Parliament that aims to further tighten gun laws. Coming up on Checkpoint on RNZ National, a business owner caught up in the latest construction company collapse says it could sink his own firm as well. A street artist completes a permanent memorial to victims of the mosque attacks, and one of the most recognisable cartoon characters has got the boot. Yep, Fireman Sam's the gone burger. We would love your feedback on anything on the programme so far this evening. You can text us on 2101, tweet us at Checkpoint RNZ, or email checkpoint@rnz.co.nz. We'll go to the 5:30 headlines, 5:30-ish headlines now with Susanna.
The Prime Minister says the terms of reference for the QC review of the Labour Party's handling of sexual assault allegations won't be released publicly until the complainants are happy with them. Jacinda Ardern says the terms are still being drafted. She says the party's focus is on making sure the terms of reference address the issues that need to be covered and that complainants are happy with them before they are released more broadly. Those who illegally trade firearms will face harsher penalties under new legislation aimed at stopping guns getting into the hands of criminals. The Police Minister Stuart Nash says a registry of guns and new offences and penalties for illegal manufacture, trafficking or changing markings on firearms will be in the new laws. Doctors would be able to notify police if they feel a licence holder shouldn't use a firearm for physical or mental health reasons, and an advisory group will be set up. And the third US Democratic debate among 10 hopefuls has brought out broad unity on toughening gun law. Helen Clark is calling on New Zealand to join the international shift on cannabis regulation, saying now is the time. The former Prime Minister spoke today at a symposium on drug law reform at Parliament, a year out from the cannabis referendum. She says Canada, Uruguay and 11 US states have all moved to legalise cannabis. A liquidator says the Stanley group of construction companies owes $9.5 million to creditors and may not have held enough money in retention as is legally required. Waterstone insolvency liquidator Damien Grant says it's too early to say for sure, but his initial opinion is that the directors might be in breach of the Construction Contracts Act. The 10 largest creditors are owed an average of more than $300,000 each. Those are the latest news headlines from RNZ National. Our next news and weather update is at 6.
Thanks, Susanna. If you're just tuning in, this is Checkpoint. I'm Lisa Owen, and Nona Peltier's joined me in the studio to talk about business. Nona, so manufacturing sector, second month where it's contracted. So yeah, what's the significance of that? Oh, get that word out.
Oh, the significance.
Yes, that's the one.
That's one. Okay, well, a reading of 50 is the sort of the neutral. So if you've got anything above 50 is expansion, anything below 50 is contraction. So it means that it's shrinking.
Yep.
Right? So we were at 48.4. Now, that's the second month we've been below 50. And part of the reason for that is a number of... now, this I should actually make very clear that this is not a survey of sentiment. This is a survey of actions, of things that have happened, and they happened in August. So new orders were down in August, and that's a contraction. Inventories were up, production was down, employment was down. These are indicators which show that that part of the economy is contracting, and that's going to have an impact on overall economic growth. So that's quite concerning. It's the production declined, and that was likely to lead to further declines in the months ahead. And so the drop in new orders was at the lowest point in more than a decade.
Wow. And so for 2 months in a row, will this be starting to make people get a bit nervy?
Well, I think that there's we've been talking about this for a while, and certainly this is part of the whole reason why the Reserve Bank moved to cut interest rates. They're saying spend, buy things. Well, of course, new orders are down. That means what? People aren't buying things. Manufacturing isn't the largest part of our economy, but it does account for things like meat and dairy. Those things are also part of that. There's other parts of our economy that's still doing quite well, but that business sentiment that we've heard about is also flowing through into real actions. So new orders down, production down, inventories up. That's not a good look.
Also, house prices. So this is interesting. Sales down.
Yes. Now that's really interesting because, well, it's not so much a surprise because inventory was down the month before, so you would expect sales to be...
So not as many people sticking their houses on the market.
Yes, and that's really quite interesting. One of the things that the Real Estate Institute said was that it seems that people with houses are reluctant to sell before they buy, which is interesting because normally you would have thought you'd sell your house and then you'd go buy something. But no, in this market, because it's so tight, people are not that willing to do that. And it's interesting that in some parts of the country, it's still pretty strong. In Auckland, it's a different story. Sales in Auckland are down, as are prices. So overall, the average median house price rose 5.5% in August to $580,000, but fell 3.5% in Auckland. So there you go. So prices are down, sales are down too.
Interesting. And what else has been happening on the markets today?
Well, lots of other things, the
As
world
always.
has been going on. But look, I think that the worry about trade has come off a bit because, both the Chinese and the United States are making soothing noises about their trade deal and gestures of goodwill and so forth. So it's all kind of making everyone feel quite comfortable. And, so our market fell a little bit, 0.4%, down 42 points to 10,863. Our dollar is steady, 64 cents, 93 that's against the US, 93.2 Australian and 51.9 British pounds.
Thanks, Nona. Have a fantastic weekend.
And you.
That's Nona Pelsier with our business news. And let's go offshore now. The British Prime Minister, Boris Johnson, is being forced to deny claims that he lied to the Queen about the suspension of Parliament. He's also faced accusations that he's broken the law and misled MPs after a Scottish court ruled his decision to suspend Parliament until October 14th was unlawful. But a Belfast judge has granted him a brief reprieve by dismissing claims that a no-deal Brexit would undermine Northern Ireland's peace process. The ABC's Eleanor Whitehead reports.
With his plans for Brexit and even his tenure as Prime Minister looking increasingly uncertain, Boris Johnson is now facing questions about his honesty.
Did you lie to the Queen when you advised her to prorogue to suspend Parliament?
Absolutely not. And indeed the High Court in England plainly agrees with us.
Calls for the Prime Minister to reopen Parliament have been mounting since Scotland's highest court of appeal ruled his decision to suspend it breached the Constitution, a verdict that will be appealed at the UK Supreme Court next week. The case was one of a series challenging his Brexit strategy. Belfast's High Court has dismissed claims that a no-deal Brexit would breach Northern Ireland's 1998 peace accord. David Finnemore is a professor of European politics at Queen's University in Belfast. He spoke earlier to RN Breakfast.
I think when we look at the implications of court rulings for progress of the Brexit, probably more important is going to be the Supreme Court ruling next week on the decision of the Prime Minister to prorogue Parliament.
Many people are frightened by the practical consequences of a no-deal Brexit, and perhaps they should be. The government's Yellowhammer document, published this week, paints a bleak worst-case scenario. It says Britain faces social unrest, border backlogs, and even food and medicine shortages if it crashes out of the EU on October 31st. But according to Defence Secretary Ben Wallace, there's nothing to see here.
These are assumptions, and then we use those assumptions to plan mitigations.
MPs are still promising to avert a crisis. This week, they passed a bill that forces the Prime Minister to ask for an extension if a deal can't be reached. But Mr Johnson says he'd rather die in a ditch than do that. Philippe Lamberts is a member of the Brexit steering group. He offered this review of the Prime Minister's tactics.
I think that his whole plan is to take the UK out of the European Union without any deal, but at the same time being in a position to blame the European Union for inflexibility.
To break the deadlock, the EU now says it's willing to revisit the idea of a Northern Ireland-only backstop. That would keep Belfast, but not the whole UK, temporarily inside the customs union. But Mr Johnson has knocked back the suggestion. Remy Davison is Jean Monnet Chair in Politics and Economics at Monash University.
It doesn't appear that the Johnson government has come up with any real proposals that would be acceptable to the EU at this stage.
And that leaves Britons no clearer on how, or even when, they'll leave the European Union.
Eleanor Whitehead in London. There have been tense exchanges at the televised debate in Houston involving the 10 leading contenders for the US Democratic Party's presidential nomination. It's the third such event, but the first to bring together the top 3 candidates, the frontrunner Joe Biden and Senators Elizabeth Warren and Bernie Sanders. Mr. Biden defended his version of Obama healthcare plan against the other senators' more costly versions. Here's one exchange with fellow candidate Julian Castro.
Barack Obama's vision was not to leave 10 million people uncovered. He wanted every single person in this country covered. My plan would do that. Your plan would not.
They do not have to buy in. They do not have to buy in.
You just said that. You just said that 2 minutes ago. You said they would have to buy in.
Have to buy in. If she qualifies for Medicaid,
are you forgetting what you said 2 minutes ago?
Be in for it.
Are you forgetting already what you said just 2 minutes ago?
The Democratic hopefuls were more united on the need for gun control, with cheers from the audience when Texas Congressman Beto O'Rourke demanded the mandatory buyback of assault weapons.
When we see that being used against children, and in Odessa, I met the mother of a 15-year-old girl who was shot by an AR-15, and that mother watched her bleed to death over the course of an hour because so many other people were shot by that AR-15 in Odessa and Midland. There weren't enough ambulances to get to them in time. Hell yes, we're going to take your AR-15, your AK-47. We're not going to allow it to be used against our fellow Americans anymore.
And high on the agenda was, of course, the long-running war in Afghanistan. Candidate Elizabeth Warren gave her solution to a conflict that has confounded both Obama and Trump.
What we're doing right now in Afghanistan is not helping the safety and security of the United States. It is not helping the safety and security of the world. It is not helping the safety and security of Afghanistan. We need to bring our troops home. And then we need to make a big shift. We cannot ask our military to keep solving problems that cannot be solved militarily. We're not going to bomb our way to a solution in Afghanistan.
Democratic Party candidate Elizabeth Warren. Back home now, and the government and the Drug Foundation say they are committed to keeping the public informed ahead of the cannabis referendum so that fearmongering and fake news is kept to a minimum. New Zealanders will vote on whether to legalise marijuana in a referendum at next year's election. MPs and the foundation spoke at a symposium on drug law reform at Parliament today, and our political reporter Charlie Drever was there.
Justice Minister Andrew Little told the crowd despite a lot of investment into the enforcement of prohibiting cannabis since 1965, it's still well and truly present in communities.
It's estimated that between 250,000 and 300,000 New Zealanders are regular users of cannabis. That's what Prohibition has given us. 54 years of Prohibition, I might add. I know those dates very well because I was born in 1965, so I'm as old as Prohibition.
Andrew Little says there has already been a lot of debate on the matter ahead of the referendum, both for and against.
Including, for example, declaring the proposition of legalisation as dopey. And I have to say, this sort of commentary, and we will see more of it, is big on assertion but light on evidence.
Andrew Little says work is underway from the government to give people neutral information.
The Ministry of Justice is working on what a public education campaign will look like, and it has to be neutral. But there will be advocacy groups on all sides who will want to contribute their part as well. But I think the government does have a responsibility to make sure that information that is claimed as fact is genuinely factual, so that we keep it focused on facts and evidence.
The Prime Minister has commissioned her Chief Science Advisor for information, and a draft piece of legislation will also be available next year to set out how the regulations will work. The Drug Foundation's Executive Director, Ross Bell, says his organisation has released their own report today on what those regulations should look like.
The government has already put a broad framework in place, but they haven't got into a lot of the nitty-gritty that I think the public are wanting to see. And so our report today is trying to provide that next level of detail. The government's taken a little bit too long to do that, so we thought, well, let's get some things out there.
Like the government's proposed framework, people under the age of 20 would not be able to enter stores or buy products, and advertising and the development of products that might appeal to more younger people, such as confectionery, would be prohibited. Ross Bell says until recently there has been a vacuum of information, but he is relaxed a year out from the referendum.
I think the public can make up their mind. They can see through the misinformation, the hysteria and fear-mongering that's being put out there at the moment. We can address that.
Among those championing the cause is former Prime Minister Helen Clark and her foundation. She says the time has come with the international movement to treat cannabis differently.
11 states have upfront legalised cannabis, and a whole lot more have legalised medicinal cannabis. You have Canada legalising, Uruguay, now Luxembourg will be the first country in Europe to formally legalise. The whole debate has shifted.
Helen Clark says people need to be upfront that it's a widely used drug, less dangerous than alcohol and tobacco, so rules should be introduced. From Parliament, for Checkpoint, Ko Charlie Drever, DNA.
It is about 10 minutes away from 6. I'm Lisa Owen and you're with Checkpoint on RNZ National. A street artist whose Auckland tribute to the victims of the mosque attacks struck a chord with the public has just completed a second permanent piece on a prominent Christchurch corner. Paul X. Walsh was invited to paint the tribute on the side of Pomeroy's pub after its owners heard him being interviewed on RNZ in March. It comes as the city prepares to mark 6 months since the March 15 mosque shootings. Our reporter Katie Todd and video journalist Simon Rogers were watching as the final touches went on.
With 12 spray cans and 3 days spent up a snorkel lift, Paul X. Walsh has seen the legacy of the mosque attack victims immortalised in 51 flowers. The recreational graffiti artist turned full-time street artist first adorned a wall in Avondale with a tribute to the mosque hero Naim Rashid 4 days after the attacks. His depiction resonating with locals, like the owners of Pomeroy's pub and Little Pom's Cafe in Christchurch, who offered him flights, accommodation and another 12 by 12 metre brick wall to unleash his creativity. This mural speaks through symbolism, taking the rough shape of a Persian mandala depicting the white flowers traditionally seen at Islamic funerals, along with tulips and roses.
And then there's also clematis, the New Zealand native, all around the outside, and at the centre is hibiscus. I've also recently learnt that we actually have a native hibiscus, the swamp hibiscus you find up in Northland. So it's a collection of flowers from around the world, each flower representing one of the victims of the attack.
Walsh, who has been in close contact with the Muslim community in past months, says the mural was partly inspired by his experience attending Eid. While Pomeroy's pub owner Ava Nakagawa helped bring him to Christchurch, she says she absolutely didn't want to interfere in the design.
I think for a piece like this, around what it's about, you don't want to have any control or anything over that. It's letting the creative process happen and also really respectfully happen, I think.
The mural coats a wall built in the 1800s and fronts an intersection about 40,000 cars whiz through each day. It's already luring interest from passers-by like Brian Cornish, who has spent about 20 years photographing Christchurch's street art and admires its healing properties.
Just witnessed what happened after the earthquake here, where art became a big focus to the community and to the council and to everybody. It was neat. There was all sorts of things going on. And as I say, it just helps the community more than anybody in particular.
And that's exactly what Walsh says he wants the mural to do.
I've realised that it becomes a dialogue with the public. It's an emotional piece and it's personal for me, but it's also a public mark of remembrance.
Walsh has already painted over his temporary Auckland mural, but not before it was replicated in Lahore, Pakistan. He and the Christchurch pub owners say this one is here to stay. For Checkpoint in Christchurch, Katie Todd.
And if you'd like to see Katie and Simon's piece, that will go up on our web page and you can see those final touches being put on that amazing mural. A state funeral will be held in Tonga's capital for the country's Prime Minister, Akalisi Pohiva. The teacher, journalist and then democracy activist turned politician died in Auckland yesterday after a battle with liver disease and pneumonia. Jacinda Ardern says authorities are working on returning his body to Tonga as soon as possible, while the kingdom begins an official mourning period. RNZ Pacific's Jamie Tahana reports.
The announcement came on national television last night. The Prime Minister, Akalisi Pohiva, had died. Semisi Sika, in a black suit in front of the black curtain, now the acting Prime Minister, made the declaration with a solemn face.
Honourable Samuela Akalisi Pohiva, e wharamahaki Auckland City Hospital. E hiwa pongpong o ahani, tōpurelolo, ko hanonga full maua o September.
The Parliament in Nuku'alofa was draped in bunting with flags at half-mast this morning. But apart from that, life was normal in the Tongan capital. A prominent civil society member, Ofa Gutenberg Likiliki, says the reality is sinking in.
There's a lot of people don't really know how to react to what's happening, and I guess it's also because of the fact that he's actually passed away outside of Tonga. I think had he been here in Tonga, it would have been more apparent. But I think what the Tongan people here in Tonga are waiting for is for his body to be brought back to Tonga, and then I think we'll see the reflections kick in.
Parliament was adjourned indefinitely in the wake of the Prime Minister's death. Tonga's cabinet is holding an emergency meeting this afternoon to discuss when Mr Pohiva's body will be returned from Auckland to Tonga and how government will now function. They will also begin planning for Mr Pohiva's state funeral. In the meantime, the tributes keep coming from Australia, New Zealand, every country in the Pacific. New Zealand's first Tongan-born Cabinet Minister, Jenny Salesa, says Mr Pohiva was a much-loved leader who held true to his values.
He was our strongest advocate. His lifelong fight was for the voice of the majority of Tongan commoners to be heard and to be represented in Tonga's parliament. And this, I think, would be one of the things he will most be remembered for.
Throughout her career, Ms Gutenberg Likiliki had regular run-ins with Mr Pohiva in her role as head of the Women and Children's Crisis Centre. But like all Tongans, she says she's reflecting on the massive contribution he made.
You know, fighting for transparency, accountability and holding members of parliament to account to their decisions, etc., etc. That was very, very new. You know, Akalisi, with his long-standing kind of history in parliament, he's been able to continue that legacy.
Mr Pohiva was also the president of the Tonga Rugby Union. The team's assistant coach, Peter Alatini, says that team too is taking it in.
So it's definitely sad news, and then the boys have rallied around and just making sure that we pay the respects that's due, and that'll carry through us, I imagine, all the way through to our tournament and making sure that he's in our thoughts going forward, and then making sure that we pay that respect back in terms of our performances throughout the tournament.
For Checkpoint, Jamie Tahana.
Well, he's one of the most recognisable cartoon characters in the world, and he was the mascot of the Lincolnshire Fire Service in Britain for years. But now Fireman Sam has been dropped for not being inclusive enough. The service says the popular children's TV character is outdated and could put women off joining its ranks. The BBC's Stephanie Prentice has the story.
That's the Fireman Sam theme tune in some of the dozens of languages the TV show airs in worldwide. Sam, the friendly Welsh firefighter, has been the star of it since the 1980s and as a result was adopted as the mascot of the Lincolnshire Fire Department in the UK and then used as a recruiting tool for the service. But now they say he's outdated and he might stop women joining up. They've pulled him as their mascot and dropped him from all promotional material. Here's the Chief Fire Officer for the area, Les Britzman.
This is not about political correctness. We're trying to recruit a modern fire service. The programme itself, the cartoon itself and series is quite up to date, but they seem to have failed to update their key character.
The London Fire Brigade backed him up in a tweet saying the use of the outdated term fireman ingrains in the young that it's a male-only role. Fireman Sam does have a female firefighter, the stoic Penny Morris, but for Lincolnshire, that's not enough. Their new mascots are 3 gender-ambiguous fire extinguishers called Freddie, Filbert and Penelope, though they've already come under fire for being confusing, with some saying they could look a bit like frogs.
Stephanie Prentice with that report. Let's change gear now and return to our earlier story on homelessness and people being put up in motels, including one person who spent 600 motel nights at a cost of more than $125,000. Dougal's been in contact. Tēnā koe, I'm a doctor in the Hut, Wellington. Every day I see 1 to 2 whānau who are in emergency housing. Some of these whānau have been in a motel unit for more than a year. Most of these whānau are required to attend in-person appointments with Housing New Zealand officers every week to prove they are looking for a house on the open market. This requirement leads to several whānau not being able to take jobs or attend courses to uplift their prospects. We have a housing crisis and existing processes are continuing to suppress the dreams of these beautiful whānau. Thanks for getting in touch, Dougal. And this one, Nick says, build these people tiny houses. 50,000 would build a nice tiny home for a small family, a permanent home. Done.
RNZ News at 6. Ngā mihi nui ko Susana Leātawa tēnei. More than $126,000 has been spent on accommodating one person in a motel while they waited for public housing to become available. Emergency housing grants, which cover short-term accommodation, were introduced in July 2016 as a stopgap measure, but are increasingly being used for longer stays as the housing crisis bites. The Salvation Army's Lynette Hudson told Checkpoint the homeless problem has been shifted from cars to motel rooms.
The government have stepped up and are responding, but it's just shifted the problem from people having been homeless and living in cars and, couch surfing, a whole range of homeless options, to being in motel units, which is really no solution at all for a permanent solution because people still don't have a home.
Lynette Hudson. Just under 1,900 households are currently being put up in motels, in one case for more than 600 nights. Helen Clark says now is the time for New Zealand to join the international shift on cannabis regulation. At a symposium on drug law reform at Parliament today, a year out from the cannabis referendum, the former Prime Minister said she has long advocated legalising and regulating cannabis. She says it should not be dealt with through the criminal system, and New Zealand should follow the example of Canada, Uruguay and 11 US states, all of which have moved to legalise the drug. The Prime Minister says the terms of reference for the QC review of the Labour Party's handling of sexual assault allegations won't be released publicly until the complainants are happy with them. The party has been the subject of intense scrutiny since a 19-year-old volunteer was reported saying she had complained about a staffer attacking her, and yet no action was taken. A QC has been appointed to review the initial investigation undertaken by party officials, but Jacinda Ardern says the terms of reference are still being drafted.
Of course, our focus is on making sure that both the issues that need to be covered are, but also that the complainants are happy with the terms of reference before they're provided more broadly.
Jacinda Ardern says her offer to meet the complainants when they feel it's the right time stands. The government has extended the deadline for public submissions on its freshwater plan. Since the plan was revealed 8 days ago, there has been some criticism, mainly from rural groups, that the consultation period is too short. Today, the Environment Minister, David Parker, announced submissions would now be accepted up to 2 weeks after the official deadline of October the 17th. He says the original 6-week consultation period is usual for submissions to select committees, but in response to requests, the government will accept submissions up to 5 p.m. on October the 31st. A mosque shooting victim is afraid to leave his Christchurch home because of being racially abused and threatened with violence. Mohammed Sahadat has been unable to work as a chef since he was shot at the Linwood Mosque. Already struggling to cope with the mental trauma of that, he says his recovery has been made harder by 2 further incidents. The first time he was with his wife when a teenager and an older man blocked their way, asked if they were from the mosque and threatened to kill them. Speaking through an interpreter, he said it happened again a short time later, this time involving another teenager.
These kind of incidents make everything fresh again for him. He doesn't feel safe to step out of house. The first incident of 2 men he was talking about, it happened on midday around 12:50. And so during the daylight, he's being tortured.
The translated words of Muhammad Sahadat. Wellington's Botanic Garden and the surrounding area has a new te reo name, which has been gifted today by Mana Whenua. The name Pai Kaka, meaning realm or perch of the kaka, will apply to the area from the top of the cable car down to Pakuao Kainga, above the southern end of Tinakori Road in Thorndon. An iwi representative, Honiana Love, who was on the naming committee, says it's a name with deep historical roots.
For me, Paikaka was a name that jumped out at me because of the return of the kaka to that area, and for me it's a sort of metaphor for what's been happening with the names being brought back into life and into use, is like the kaka returning to the area.
Honiana Love. Once the City Council has formally adopted the name, it will be incorporated into branding and signage. An Auckland woman has pleaded guilty to defrauding a Māori school of about $250,000. 51-year-old Kim Symes was convicted of obtaining by deception using forged documents and dishonestly using documents when she appeared in the Manukau District Court today. The charges were brought by the Serious Fraud Office. From 2006 to 2017, Symes was employed as a part-time support staff administrator by the Māori Immersion School Te Kura Kaupapa Māori o Te Tonga o Hokianga. She has been remanded on bail for sentencing in November. It's 6:05. The Sydney radio station 2GB says it will review its Alan Jones breakfast program as well as several other programs. There has been an exodus of advertisers from the station since the broadcaster made controversial comments last month, the ABC's Kathleen Calderwood reports.
Alan Jones was put on notice by Macquarie Media following comments he made about New Zealand Prime Minister Jacinda Ardern. Jones has apologised for saying Scott Morrison should shove a sock down Ms Ardern's throat, but has been told that any repeat performances will lead to his contract being terminated. Today, Macquarie Media Chair Russell Tate wrote to advertisers saying they are reviewing Jones's show, as well as all other 2GB and 4BC programs. Jones has told the ABC the review is a management matter and he's getting on with the job.
Kathleen Calderwood in Sydney. Now to sports news. All Blacks flanker Luke Jacobson says it wasn't easy deciding to quit the Rugby World Cup 8 days out from the opening game. The 22-year-old has been forced out of the tournament. Jacobson suffered concussion last month after his Test debut, but was past fit to play against Tonga last weekend. He appeared to come through that match well, but says problems emerged after the All Blacks' first training in Japan.
Something that I've been working towards, getting to the World Cup and being able to play here, represent the country. But I guess it's not meant to be, so decided with medical team and coaches and whatnot that probably better for me to give it a rest and let it get right.
The Tasman flanker Shannon Frizzell is Jacobson's replacement. Cameron Leslie wants to compete in swimming and wheelchair rugby at next year's Tokyo Paralympics. The triple swimming gold medalist helped the Wheel Blacks qualify for next year's games before getting back into the pool to win his 5th world title in London. He says it's been his dream to take part in both sports at the Paralympics.
We haven't looked at the schedules to see if logistically it all works yet. I've been very focused on just getting the job done first before we start looking at that sort of stuff.
Cameron Leslie. And Lee Holdsworth has pipped Shane van Gisbergen to be fastest on day one of the Supercars Auckland Super Sprint. Championship leader Scott McLaughlin was 7th quickest. That's the news.
This Saturday on Music 101, join me, Charlotte Ryan, from midday. Beck Runga joins me in studio to talk about her personal journey singing Sway in Te Reo.
I didn't really speak any Māori except for maybe what you get at primary school, so it was kind of a bit of a learning curve.
The Music Awards. Music 101, this Saturday from midday on RNZ National.
Now the short forecast will ease. Westland rain easing to isolated showers. Canterbury, rain easing to isolated showers, rain returning to the north tomorrow afternoon. For Otago, Southland and Fiordland, occasional showers, some heavy at first in the south, mainly fine tomorrow. Chatham Islands fine, then a few showers from the evening. Rain late tomorrow. RNZ National, it's 6:09.
Thanks, Susanna. This is Checkpoint and I'm Lisa Owen. One of the people who first brought Labour scandal to light says the party has a long way to go before it's clear it has had learnt from its mistakes. The party's been under fire for how officials and senior politicians have responded to allegations against a former staffer, ranging from bullying to serious sexual assault. The focus is now shifting to the review of the party's handling of the complaints and whether it has a wide enough scope. Here's our Deputy Political Editor, Craig McCulloch.
It's been a week from hell for Labour, and if the party had hoped yesterday's resignation would ease the public scrutiny, it's sorely mistaken. The Labour staffer accused of sexual assault quit his job at Parliament yesterday, but at least one complainant says it doesn't end here. She's not one of the 7 people who laid formal complaints, but she says she had spoken up about problematic behaviour by the staffer before, one of 12 people to do so. In a statement, she says there is still an urgent need for culture change within the party. These are her words, but not her voice.
There's a long way before we can say that the Labour Party has learnt from any of its mistakes. We need to see reform, not just cover-ups and resignations.
The man accused insists he is innocent and adamantly rejects all reported allegations. In a statement issued by his lawyer, he says he'll comply with the new inquiry, having been cleared by the first one. The woman who issued a statement to RNZ says that makes her feel sick. There are growing questions about that new review led by Maria Dew QC and exactly how wide its scope will fall, with media reporting discord within the party's council. Ms Ardern says the terms of reference are still being drafted.
Of course, our focus is on making sure that both the issues that need to be covered are, but also that the complainants are happy with the terms of reference before they're provided more broadly.
At least one of the formal complainants has expressed a desire to meet with Ms Ardern away from anyone else. And the Prime Minister says the offer has been made and her door is open.
My understanding is they know the offer's there. I think there's just probably some consideration as to whether or not they would like to meet with the QC first or myself. But as I say, open, ready and willing whenever it is best from their perspective.
Ms Ardern found some support today from her friend and mentor Helen Clark. The former Prime Minister was at Parliament for a separate event and expressed total support for Ms Ardern.
I know she's been let down. End of story.
She says she can appreciate the position the Prime Minister's in.
I'm a very strong supporter of Jacinda Ardern. I have sat in her seat. I know what it's like when people around you let you down. She will deal with it and she will move on.
But moving on may not be as easy as just that, with pressure from within for a total culture change and a review due to report back in about a month's time. Atu iti whare parimata mō te hōtaka o te ahiahi ko Craig McCulloch.
A business owner caught up in the collapse of the Stanley group of construction companies says it could sink his own firm as well. 6 Stanley Construction Group companies were placed into liquidation last week and 4 associated tallwood companies with 120 staff in Waikato and Auckland laid off. Today's first liquidators report shows the companies owe creditors $9.5 million. It also says it may not have held enough money in retention as it was legally required to do. And the group's directors are blaming significant underpricing of a large Housing New Zealand project for their woes. Jordan Bond reports.
Troy Patchett believes there's a slim to zero chance his ventilation company will get any of the $60,000 he's owed by the Stanley Group. If the money doesn't come, it'll have a knock-on effect. He won't be able to pay the people he owes money to.
That just could be a chain of events that if we don't receive any funds to pay off our suppliers or subcontractors, then we may end up being liquidated ourselves.
About 250 companies are owed at least $10,000 each by Stanley. Some of the larger ones are owed a few $100,000 each. There are also potentially hundreds of other companies that won't be paid, like the creditors Mr. Patchett owes, all caught up by association because one large company's gone bust.
And they've got families, they've got bills that they need to pay, they've all got mortgages, things like that. It keeps you awake at night, not just from a financial point of view, but from a moral point of view. You don't want to see other people in a position where they may not be able to soak up this loss.
There's frustration that people can go into a deal in good faith with a reputable contractor and come out the other side with nothing.
It feels like they can just chuck in the towel and go, right, well, we've stuffed up and we're going to close ship, and unfortunately, it means that you're not getting paid, but there's a real roll-on effect.
But why would a 90-year-old construction group wind up like this in the middle of a building boom? The first report by the liquidator, Damien Grant, says the company underquoted a large construction job for Housing New Zealand, underestimating the cost by $2 million.
Those issues were then compounded as you get into the cash flow situations. You end up juggling stuff, and then they had cost overruns in addition to that $2 million. So that project really was the anchor that sunk the Stanley Group.
Adding to that, Mr. Grant says it appears the company did not hold enough money in retention as required by law. Mr. Grant says it's too early to say for sure, but his initial opinion is that the directors might be in breach of the Construction Contracts Act. Another creditor, Dave Burt, says if it's true, the directors should be held to account for this.
If there's any misappropriations as far as the retention fund is concerned, and if there's any evidence of reckless trading, I really want to see those directors held to account. If $9 million of other people's money has gone, someone needs to be held to account. You can't do a heist for $9 million. It'd be all over the world radio.
Mr. Burt says ideally it should be a Crown agency that pursues prosecution if there are grounds. He says creditors are getting legal advice, and if something's amiss, he won't hesitate to act himself. Mō te hōtaka o te ahiahi nei, ko Jordan Bond, tēnei.
It's 6:15 and you're with Checkpoint on RNZ National. The usually close relationship between Israel and the United States is being tested today over reports the Israelis have been caught bugging the White House. The claim has come amid growing international outrage over Benjamin Netanyahu's declaration that he'll annex parts of the West Bank if he wins next week's general election. European leaders and the Palestinians say such a move would effectively kill off the peace process. The ABC's Barney Porter reports.
It might be a case of with friends like these, etc., etc. The American news website Politico is today reporting that after 2 years of investigation, US officials believe Israel is most likely to have planted mobile phone surveillance devices found near the White House and other sensitive locations around Washington. The miniature devices are known as stingrays. They mimic regular phone towers to fool mobile devices into providing their locations and identity information. Officials at the Department of Homeland Security say it's likely the devices were intended to spy on President Donald Trump, his aides and closest associates. Politico's Daniel Lippman.
Senior U.S. intelligence officials saying the FBI did this analysis and they determined it was most likely Israel. These weren't like lower level, people at these agencies.
And he has his own take on why.
Israel still has an interest in understanding, hey, is Trump going to meet with Rouhani? What are their discussions?
Mr. Netanyahu has scoffed at the idea.
Absolutely not. We have a directive. I have a directive. No intelligence collection in the United States. No spying.
Mr. Trump, in his own way, has left the door slightly ajar.
I don't believe that. No, I don't think the Israelis were spying on us. I really would find that hard to believe. My relationship with Israel has been great. No, I don't believe that. I wouldn't believe that story. Anything's possible, but I don't believe it.
Perhaps the last line should go to a former senior US intelligence official who told Politico suspicions the Israelis are spying on the White House do raise security concerns. But then he joked, on the other hand, guess what we do in Tel Aviv? For the moment, though, much of the international focus on Israel remains with Mr. Netanyahu's vow to annex the strategic heartland of the West Bank if he wins next week's election. Today, the Jordan Valley is seen as the breadbasket of any future Palestinian state in the West Bank. Its annexation would leave more than 2 million Palestinians with little more than isolated enclaves. Reaction has been swift.
Annexation of occupied territories is a war crime.
The chief Palestinian negotiator, Saeb Erekat.
The international community must stand tall now, all, to say a big no and to stop treating Israel as a country above the laws of man.
But whether or not it happens will, of course, be determined by that election result.
And that was Barney Porter in Washington. Frustration is building between Christchurch restaurant owners and taxi drivers over the lack of parking in the city, with no solution in sight. A bar owner is fed up with taxi drivers sitting in car parks, saying it stops people from coming into the city. However, taxi drivers say they have little choice with so few taxi stands available within the city's 4 avenues. The tension follows reports of small businesses struggling in the CBD, which prompted a major advertising campaign by the council to get people back into the city centre. Nicholas Poynton filed this report.
On Christchurch's busy Hereford Street, 2 taxis sit in 5-minute car parks and have not moved for the past 30 minutes. 100 metres down the road is a taxi stand which is filled to capacity. Taxis not paying for car parks is an issue which has frustrated the Little Fiddler pub co-owner Mel Ling for some time now.
When they're not paying for it, they're taking up car parks where people in town need to use them. And there's a big difference from quickly parking there and paying $3 to going to a car park building where you get charged twice as much when you're just running in and out.
In August, a Council Commission report revealed that shoppers preferred to stick to the suburbs rather than venture into the city. Ms Ling believes the lack of parking in the CBD is a major reason why people have shied away. She says taxis taking up car parks is affecting her business.
When there's day business going on, it does affect your day trade. At night, people are more likely to drink more and they taxi in and taxi home for safety reasons. Totally get that. But during the day, it's during the day and the rudeness involved in it that really winds a lot of people up.
Ms Ling's attempts to confront the drivers have been met with abuse.
And when you try to talk to them or go to explain it, they just abuse you. I've been called quite a few pretty little things so far, and it gets to a point where you're almost intimidated by them.
Ms Ling and her husband have singled out Blue Star taxis, complaining to the company about the harassment. Blue Star declined to be interviewed but says they have received no complaints about their drivers verbally abusing the public. Ms Ling says while she is frustrated, she empathises with the drivers.
I mean, I know they've got their business to do and all that, so, I mean, the council obviously has to put more taxi ranks in somewhere during the day. At night, I mean, at night down here is just chaos, full stop, whether you're a taxi driver or an Uber driver anyway. But, I mean, I understand that at 11 o'clock onwards, fine. Those are the rules. We abide by them. We don't go and park in taxi ranks during the day.
Taxi drivers on the streets of Christchurch echo the same message, saying there are not enough taxi stands in the city. One taxi driver, who did not want to be named, says the lack of taxi stands means competition for a space can be fierce. He says drivers are often slapped with $200 fines by the police if they are parked just outside a taxi stand.
So if there's 4 cars you can park at the stand, and if your car is hanging out a little bit out of the park, out of the taxi stand, which is yellow line, you get the ticket same time. So especially on the weekends, you don't make much money because there are heaps of taxis out there. So if you got a ticket like $200 a night, pretty much whatever you earn, your money is gone. But the problem is, end of the story, like we don't have enough parking in the city.
He called for the police and parking wardens to use their discretion. Christchurch City Council parking compliance leader Darryl O'Keefe reiterated that his job is to enforce parking-related offending, although he says parking wardens will often try to find amicable solutions.
My staff will always try to gain compliance first. We do, the exception to that is if we've got a trouble spot area, which again is that Hereford Street area where it's a standing complaint, so they'll just issue infringement notices. They won't ask them to move. But in general, they try to get compliance in the first instance.
Mr O'Keefe says there are between 45 and 50 taxi spaces available in the city. In March, the council voted to create 4 more taxi stands along Hereford Street, but no date has yet been set for their completion. For Checkpoint, Nicholas Poynton.
Let's head back to the States now, and a US congressional committee has voted to intensify its investigation of President Donald Trump as it edges closer to impeachment proceedings. The Democratic-led Judiciary Committee has adopted a resolution that will speed up the investigation that is expanding into areas that could prove politically explosive for both Mr. Trump and Congress. The CBC's White House correspondent Paul Hunter has the details.
Ayes have it. The resolution is agreed to. This concludes our business for today.
Just symbolism? Maybe, but with that vote, Democrats today took their biggest step yet toward what some here call the I word, the impeachment of Donald Trump. Chair of the Judiciary Committee, Democrat Jerry Nadler.
The resolution before us represents the necessary next step in our investigation of corruption, obstruction, and abuse of power.
Technically, today's vote was to approve the rules for the committee's investigations now to come, making it easier, say some, for lawmakers to dive in on some of the allegations that have dogged the Trump presidency. Did he, in the eyes of Congress, obstruct justice? Did he wrongly pay off Stormy Daniels? Is he profiting from his own presidency? And what about his campaign's contact with Russia during the 2016 campaign? And while the investigation is not an impeachment hearing, it's Nadler's committee that could recommend one to the House of Representatives. A thorny question for sure, given Democrat worries that despite the questions around Trump, plenty of Americans just don't want to go there, said House Leader Nancy Pelosi today, who treads carefully on impeachment. Let's see.
We are on our path. Where it takes us is where we will follow the facts. That's what it is.
Republicans, meanwhile, are pushing back hard.
You know, I've wanted a long time to be able to say this. Welcome to Fantasy Island.
That's Representative Doug Collins. Underlining today's step is pure smoke and mirrors, aimed simply at negative headlines for a president Democrats can't stand.
The Judiciary Committee has become a giant Instagram filter to make you appear that something's happening that's not.
Still, it's Democrats who control the proceedings, with witnesses to be heard, evidence called, and, safe to say, constant reminders on what it's all about, the behavior of Donald Trump.
The conduct under investigation poses a threat to our democracy. We have an obligation to respond to this threat, and we are doing so.
The hearings begin next week. First up, Trump's one-time campaign manager, Corey Lewandowski, who's evidently happy to take questions.
The CBC's Paul Hunter in Washington. Daniel Johnston, whose guileless homemade recordings inspired dozens of musicians from Kurt Cobain to Lana Del Rey, has died at the age of 58. The eccentric American songwriter and artist passed away by natural causes at his home in Texas, according to a statement from his family. He was a cult figure mourned online today by those he inspired, including musician Beck and film star Elijah Wood, who called him a gentle, beautiful treasure. The BBC's David Solito looks back on his life.
My name is Daniel Johnston. This is the name of my tape. It's Hi, How Are You?
Daniel Johnston.
I was having a nervous breakdown when I recorded it.
Try to remember, but my feelings can't know for sure.
He recorded his songs on a little cassette player, and back in the 80s he moved from his home in West Virginia to Texas.
When I moved to Austin, I give tapes to everybody on the street. And so when I did my first show, the house was packed and they were screaming and I loved it. It was great.
A few days later, he was in a mental hospital.
Everyone and friends and family.
In one incident, his father, a pilot, was flying a plane. Daniel grabbed the keys and threw them out of the window mid-flight, forcing a crash landing into a forest.
Why are you so odd? Hello, I am the ghost of Daniel Johnston.
There's nowhere to go and no way to win.
He was more than troubled, but his songs, Nirvana, Tom Waits, The Flaming Lips, Beck, Wilco, they were all fans. The scratchy, lo-fi innocence was part of the template for a whole musical scene, which was eventually recognized in an award-winning documentary.
Since the movie came out, I get 4 or 5 letters a week and it says, "Hi, Daniel, I love your music. I, too, am mentally ill."
Oh, really?
Don't be sad, I know you will.
It was a life of delusions and breakdowns, but in his music there was always wit, honesty, and hope.
But don't give up until,
especially in the song that came to define him.
True love will find you.
True love will find you in the end.
All right, thanks a lot, everybody. Thank you. Thank you for your time.
And that was David Solito reporting there. Just before we go, some feedback on a couple of our stories today. This one on the number of people in emergency housing, motels, we mean. This person says, why isn't this government fast-tracking tiny homes legislation? Great for solo or small families, cheaper, and already a number of builders doing them. Portland has built a village of small cabins for homeless and the residents love them. This one from Michael in Tauranga. The increasing emergency housing grants are as a result of the waiting list for social housing more than doubling over the last 2 years, but the government social housing building program not increasing. And this one from a listener who has kind of, tied two of the stories together, which is the housing story and also the Southern response issue. They say, why is there more help for an 18-year-old that has a 1-year-old child and is pregnant again than people that have been working all their lives and are being screwed by the government insurance company? We need to consider those who have been playing by the rules and have been paying their dues and taxes all their lives. They go on to say most older people are too proud to ask for help and they just carry on. This is not fair. In response to our interview with the chair of Southern Response, Alistair James, this person says, hi Lisa, I'd rate Southern Response a -10. The interviewee's attitude is deeply disgusting to me. He sounds heartless. That from Beth of Invercargill. Have a great weekend. We will be back on Monday.
RNZ News headlines at 6:30. More than $126,000 has been spent on accommodating one person in a motel while they waited for public housing to become available. Former Prime Minister Helen Clark says the moment is ripe for New Zealand to join the international shift on cannabis regulation. The Prime Minister, Jacinda Ardern, says she's ready and willing to meet those who have complained about Labour's handling of sexual assault complaints whenever they want. And a mosque shooting victim is afraid to leave his Christchurch home because of being racially abused and threatened with violence. Those are the headlines. Our next news at 7.
Take the pulse of the day's news every weeknight at 10.
This really is a big scandal and it's now being covered internationally by lots of media and it really is alarming a lot of people, even in the Labour Party.
Lately with me, Karen Hayes, your late night eye on the latest headlines and the people who are making them.
The media portrays a stereotype about what it's like to grow up